Hello. Oh, excuse me. Oh, it's going to be one of those days. Welcome to Wednesday at 1, the Bible study group. And I hope that you are having a good day, taking a little break from the outside world where it seems to be getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And we'll have a little chance here to jump into Miss Ruth, um, one of the few Bible study, or one of the few books in the Bible named for a woman. So I see all you women coming on board and appreciate that. So I want to get started this morning or this afternoon. We had talked about a number of different books that we could go to, and so I'm still looking for ideas. And Peggy, I did find your original memo to me with some ideas, and that we'll be using some of those. But I thought Ruth would be a good one to do because it's short, and so we have a couple of weeks. We'll do this for a couple of weeks, and then we'll move on. Maybe pick up some of those short books in the Old Testament, especially because we don't spend probably enough time in the Old Testament. I'm thinking along the lines of Jonah and Micah, and then Peggy was interested in looking at Esther, so we might do that as well. So let us begin with a brief word of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this day, and we thank you for all of those who would gather today to spend some time in your word. We thank you for Ruth and her witness and her testimony to the love of God, and also to the action that she took in ways to keep her family going and to keep her legacy strong. So we thank you for her spunk, and we thank you for her story, and we ask that you might see perhaps some ways that we might be like Ruth as we continue our stories in these days. We pray all these things in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who is the Word. Amen. Hello, Phil. Good to see you. Good to see all of you. Pam, Peggy, Linda, and Phil so far. The mighty, the few, the mighty, the Bible studiers. So, I hope that the picture is okay. I'm doing this from home today. Got some workers, and so I need to kind of be around. So anyway, I do not have with me my Lutheran Study Bible because it's that big one that I use, and it's in the office. So I don't have that. I'm still using an NRSV, so the words will be the same. But you may have notes that I don't have notes on. So I am using the HarperCollins Study Bible, which is probably maybe 10 years before the Lutheran Study Bible. So there may be some interesting notes that you have that are updated scholarship from what I have. So feel free to interrupt and take issue with what I'm saying, because if I'm using this as a resource, and I bet there is more current scholarship. So feel free to intersect or interject rather. I want to put this in a little bit of context. One of the things I was thinking about was going ahead and starting out at the very beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, and then moving forward through the histories. And that would take us from Genesis to Exodus. We would skip Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then move over to Joshua and Judges. And then we would come upon Ruth. The book of Ruth is basically a family story, but it ends with kind of a salutation to King David. You all know that Ruth was King David's grandmother. So towards the end of the story, then all of us wonder, the scholars wonder about who wrote this particular book of Ruth. I mean, Ruth didn't write it down. So it was probably written a while after her death, during what we call the United Monarchy. So if you recall the history where the people left Egypt with Moses and went and wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they came into the Promised Land, which is now Israel, Palestine. The land of Canaan, which had a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. I'm sorry, we're not in the library and you can't see that, but you probably have that in the back of your book, a map of the divided kingdoms and the united monarchy. The two kingdoms, the north of Israel in the north, Samaria, took most of the fertile land and most of where the 12 tribes settled in the land that was used for agriculture. The south of Judah, capital of Jerusalem, was more prairie land, desert land, and that's where most of the tribes who were not nomads, shepherds, and people who had flocks, and they needed to graze, but they didn't need the farmland as much. So the southern kingdom was where wealthy people lived, and then the people in the north were tenant farmers and the producers of those things that eventually that were needed by both of the kingdoms. There was all kinds of warring and fighting and disagreements and all kinds of things in going on between the two kingdoms, and in that time that God called forth judges, and judges took over certain territories. They were like local governors, but they were the ones who dealt with any kind of conflict that needed to be worked on, any kind of mediation that needed to be done. And these, some of these were very famous. One of the ones that you will recognize the name is Deborah, was one of the judges and one of the first women written about in Scripture as a leader of the people. So, so in that time of Judges, sometimes it worked really well and sometimes it didn't. And when it wasn't working well, the people would cry out to God, you know, give us a king, give us a king. And the only time I think in Israel that the people of Israel were satisfied with their king was under the reign of King David, Ruth's grandson. And so David became the shining star of history, of great leadership. And you know, he was kind of the George Washington, if assuming that Washington was a good leader. I'm not sure anymore sometimes of as history is getting picked apart and put back together. But assume David was the wonderful king who was not only the leader of the government, but consolidated the government and the church by bringing by being the high priest of the temple and the church, or the Jewish expression, the synagogues, the system, the religious system of of the day was consolidated in the city of Jerusalem by David. So he had both the title high priest and king. So both church and state were centralized in Jerusalem. But before that happened, just as they were trying to start to look for a king, dismantling or the judge system was kind of falling apart, that is where we find Ruth. Now, in Christian Bibles, Ruth comes immediately following the book of Judges, and because it is an illustrative story of the time of the judges and that transition time from judges to kings. And so the placement in Scripture is a chronological placement. But in the Hebrew Bible, they have Ruth is more of a liturgical setting. They put her with the writings, with the wisdom writings. So she's a little bit further back in the scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, and she's collected with the 5 scrolls, which would include Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and some of those writings. But one of the things that's interesting is that in the Hebrew Bible, because she is classified with the wisdom writings, then her book is read every year during the Pentecost season, during the Feast of Weeks, which glorifies both the giving of the law and then the wisdom that came along with that. So the Jewish population sees her as a wisdom source, whereas we just put her into the order of the history there, which is chronological. From Ruth, we get into First and Second Chronicles, then First and Second Kings, where we get the stories of David and Solomon and Saul and all those great leaders of the time. Some great, some not so great, some greatly not so great. So that kind of gives you an idea. And we're talking here, remember Pastor Susan's timeline. You got King David is on my elbow at about 1,000, Moses at about 1,500 BC, Abraham and Sarah at 2,000 BC. So between Moses, but much closer to David, so between 1500 BC and 1000 BC, that 500-year period really ends with the the um, the people living in the Promised Land, judges governing them, and then as that starts to decay and they start to move towards a king, we get the story of Ruth. So it's probably, I think they date it between 700 and 900 BC. And again, you may have a note that tells that differently. So sorry, I don't have the same introduction and the same notes that you have, but I think take a moment this week and read the introduction if you haven't already, especially if you had the Lutheran Study Bible, because that would be some of the most current. So a couple of things before we get started. Hebrew names are incredibly important during this time. Once they were in the Promised Land, the naming of children could really become kind of a symbol of the yearning for a new kind of life. It seems odd that, they're in the Promised Land, they're where they've been yearning to be for thousands of years, and yet here we go. Things are starting to fall apart again as we humans seem to be in the midst of that all the time, of changing terrain and changing culture and changing power structures. So the book of Ruth is kind of pastoral in tone. It is a lot about people doing wonderful things to sustain and continue families. And so the plot revolves around relationships, which is really clearly not the normal thematic structure for a book in Scripture. But we're going to see these relationships and how they play out, and then how they all contribute, so that when Ruth finally was written down, the story of Ruth, that they all contribute to this narrative that's beginning to get more and more clear through the Hebrew Bible, that will get picked up then in the New Testament with the coming of Jesus. So all of this is part of it would be Ruth and David, obviously the people around them would be listed in both the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, to include the lineage from which Jesus came. So the other thing you need to know about is the Hebrew word chesed, and that's the CH sound, chesed. Chesed is basically loyalty or faithfulness, and we talk about chesed most often in the person of the Godhead, so that God's love is steadfast. And in Psalms, the word chesed is over and over and over and over again: God's steadfast love, God's steadfast love, God's steadfast love. So we think even of this word as a word that is an identifier for the divine. And yet, this major theme in Ruth, I think, is this faithfulness, this loyalty to family and to homeland, and all of these things. So it's kind of interesting to see how the story of Ruth kind of is an echo of the whole people of Israel, which is, I'm sure, why it was lifted up and written down, because she was honored as King David's grandmother, and then also kind of as a symbol of the journey of the people of Israel. So I think that's enough to get us started today with give you a little grounding in the context of where this is. After, it is, as I say, just a personal story of this woman and her family that comes out of the concept of judges and will take us into the concept of kings. So it's a kind of a transition book. So let's hear about Ruth and her transitions. It starts out with Ruth's mother-in-law. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, excuse me, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So just that little bit already, you know a lot of stuff that you're going to make connections to. This man, Elimelech, and El is the Hebrew word for God. Melech is the Hebrew word for king. So Elimelech was like God is king. So he was a faithful man. He was born and came from the land of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, and Bethlehem, which is just south of Jerusalem. So this is where we get the connection with Bethlehem and Jesus and David, Mary and Joseph having to go to Bethlehem to register because their families came out of that area. So, but also you see here we have Naomi now, who not only has lost her husband, but has also lost both of her sons, who are, so she's got nothing. So she's at a place where, she can't move on. So I am seeing some funny things on my feed, and so let me know if you are if I'm bouncing in and out here, and I could maybe move to a different room, but I think we're okay. Anyway, so a couple more things about these Hebrew names. Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah means the back of the neck. And Orpah is going to be the one who turns around and leaves when Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. And then we have Mahlon and Chilion, the sons, and they are, those words, Mahlon is sickness and Chilion is spent. So these two, were kind of, looks like they were sort of destined for not having a long life. So can somebody post and tell me that if you're hearing me and seeing me, or if you're having trouble with me going in and out, because I can switch to my phone if that's a problem. Okay, so let me read a little bit more, and then maybe somebody can let me know what's going on. Then she started to return, this is Naomi, then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. I'm going to take a little break. Okay, looks like everything's good. Oh, good. All right. Um, so anyway, so we have this wonderful scene where the girls come to their mother-in-law, and she says, "I'm going to go home, and you go home too. Go back to your families. Go back. You know, you are widows. You need people to take care of you." And they're hanging on her, saying, "No, no, we don't. We want you to take care of us." It already tells you how strong Naomi was, because she was, it looks like she was willing, to have them come with her, but she's trying to get them to go back to their own families, um, and so Orpah decides to go back, and Ruth just says, "Nope, I don't care. I'm going with you. I'd rather be with you than than know that I have a certain future with my family or with here the people in Moab." And then this beautiful kind of little poem that is often used at weddings. And I always kind of chuckle when people say, "Oh, I want that one that says, 'Entreat me not to leave you.'" And there's the song that everybody knows. But very few people know that this is a scene between a mother and her daughter-in-law, not between a man and a woman. But certainly the words are lovely at the beginning of a wedding journey or a marriage journey, to make these kinds of vows, to take on each other's lives as part of your own. So um, a good choice, just a different context. So any questions or anything? I know this is not as easy a place to have conversation as it would be if we were around the table. And I'm thinking our numbers are getting. The hard part is the numbers watching live are dwindling, and yet by the end of the day, I will have another 100 people who have watched. Um, so it's probably going to be a while before we meet in person again. But if we get this smallish group, I may switch over to a Zoom format so that we can have some conversation when we get out of these the books of the Bible that we're going to look at that are really contain stories. So let me just go ahead and read on here. So the two of them, that would be Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, but call me Mara," means bitterness. "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Okay, so that's going to give you an idea. The beginning of the barley harvest is going to give you the idea that we're starting to come into the festival season, the beginning of the harvest. So we would have been having, and at this time they didn't have the same depth of festival participation as they would once the temple is built, and everybody used those as pilgrimage festivals so that everybody came to Jerusalem. But there were the foundations of these rituals where the first fruits would come in, the harvest would come, and then the baskets would be given to those who were offering pastoral care to the tribes, the Levites, and that were fed and taken care of by each of the tribes, so that that thing has sort of started here. So the other thing that's kind of interesting to me here is that I don't know, people get, they always talk about Naomi and Ruth's faithfulness to this image of what Naomi has stood in for, the faith in a God, in the, the monotheistic God rather than gods of Moab. So um, we don't really know what it was that stuck Ruth to Naomi, but it could have been, she's willing to take on her people and her God. And so this is kind of a journey of faith and trust for Ruth, um, to come from a land to a brand new country. And, interesting to talk about how Naomi was welcomed into Bethlehem, but was trying to explain to people, that she was a changed woman, and she's got in tow with her this foreigner, So, and that's one of the cool things about Old Testament times. There is this edict and this very clear sense of hospitality that foreigners, aliens, and foreigners who were living among the people in the land were up there with widows as far as people taking care of them. So it wasn't like Naomi was shunned or anything for bringing this Moabite woman with her, this Gentile woman. And obviously, we have not yet got to the Levitical purity codes and that sort of thing that would have, made Naomi unclean. We're not into those kind of temple purification designations yet. So Naomi was fine, bringing Ruth with her and living with her and having her part of the family. Okay, I'm expecting, if you have any thoughts or questions, that you'll type them in. So this is the beginning of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. And as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." And she fell prostrate, with her face to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her." You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. And she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all the harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so here we have a really good description of the life of an immigrant, an alien in the land, who comes and is smart enough to know she can glean, which means work around the edges of the field or whatever has already been harvested, then go pick up the grains that were dropped to the ground or whatever had been left after the harvesters, the reapers, went through. And this is became actually part of the temple instruction on how to deal with widows and orphans and aliens, that they were allowed to go into any field that had been harvested already and take whatever was left. And that's kind of how they that's how they ate and how they were fed. But it was really at the temple's direction that gleaning was codified, in that's how the widows were taken care of. So here we see a very smart Ruth who says, "I'm going to go and glean, but I'm going to go right behind the reapers, and I'm going to hopefully make friends with some of the people who are reaping, whether they be the women, Boaz's women and servants, or the people who were hired, the reapers, who would have been men doing that work." So she had a plan to work her way into the little community of harvesters and workers who were out in the field, and was very successful at doing that. And just so happened, and people who, people of faith would look at this and say, "Here's how God provides." It just so happens that Boaz owned that part of the field. And it just so happens that he had come in that day from Jerusalem to just check and see how the harvest was going. And that's when he sees Ruth, which tells me a couple of things. Tells me he sees Ruth and he knows that she's not one of his servants. You kind of think of, this is one of those where you got a man who's got a bunch of servant girls and you immediately assume they're for his pleasure. But he obviously, for whatever reason, he knew the women who were his servants, who were working for him or serving him. And he didn't know Ruth. So, but one of the first things that he says is, "You need to eat, let me feed you, let me give you some leeway in where you can glean, and, take care of you in that way. And I will also let you share from the water that the reapers pull up from the well, so you don't have to do that for yourself. And sit next to him at dinner and make sure that the men don't bother her." So she is now under the protection of Boaz, which is, pretty interesting that encounter started out the way it did, with him readily accepting this position as her protector. I mean, he was, in essence, her father-in-law's brother, so her uncle-in-law. So they were kin, they were related, and through marriage. And this was his. Whether he saw this as his duty, I don't know that he knew who she was. Although he did hear, he says, at one point that he had heard how she had taken care of Naomi. So he was caring for her both because it was the right thing to do and because of her caring for Naomi, his brother's widow. So it's interesting how this story moves forward, which I think is a wonderful thing. So I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep on keeping on here. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "Daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz." Oh, I just love this because this is so much a Jewish mother. You know, my dear, I have to make sure you know that you don't, this isn't just kind of a you know, kind of a temporary kind of situation. I want to make sure that you're taken care of. So she says, "I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, and got up before one person could recognize another, for he said, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak that you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Okay. Couple of things that you need to know is that this was a, not only just as we read it with English, a pretty gutsy thing for her to do, to wait until he is asleep and then come and nuzzle up next to him. But when it says uncover his feet, they use the word feet for his genitals. So she crept up next to him and just uncovered him and snuggled down there. Um, and then when he's, what does it, how she puts it? Um, oh, I can't find it. Where is this? She said,